So there's a few things I want to get done. And the first is just to review the intent and purpose of this course, what it is, why we put it together, what it's all about. And this is not necessarily intended to be like an instructor training. I just wanted to share this information with as many, kind of key people as I could. And I wanted to have the opportunity, like I said, to record this content so I continue to share it. And I do think at this point, even with the small group, Steve and I are the only ones that have been involved in the creation of this content from end to end. And so getting some input and feedback from Mick, Jim, and Danielle will also be helpful. So what we're going to do is kind of go through the instructor manual content section by section, what's in there, what it's all about, what the different objectives are. I'm going to share some thoughts on how to teach this effectively in actual trainings in person. Steve, please chime in as we're going through that. And then at the end of each section, kind of once we've presented that content, I'd like to just kind of open it up for any questions or alternative ideas that you may, come to in your mind as to how this content could potentially be effectively delivered. And really want it to be collaborative because, each of you, while you may or may not have been involved in this course very much in the past, has certainly been involved in training and other related type of work. So everybody's insight is going to be valuable. And I'm going to spend some time, I think, on a number of these sections, comparing it and contrasting it with crew leadership for trails, the OSI crew leadership for trails course, which it's basically essentially a knock, I don't know if a knockoff or a spin-off course. Yeah, a pared down version of that course. There's a lot in here that I think is, especially for all of you that have done it before, is going to be insightful, kind of understanding the differences, the similarities, comparing and contrasting with a crew leader training. And like I said, we're recording this for future use. So just real quick about the course, given an overview. It was created in 2016. Initially had 4 groups working on the initial manual, VOC and the Outdoor Stewardship Institute, some representatives from the Forest Service, Roaring Fork Outdoor Volunteers, and Roaring Fork Mountain Bike Association. Shortly after that, we worked with the Continental Divide Trail Coalition to create a CDT adopter manual based on that content, but with more content specific to their needs. And then all of these groups, minus the Forest Service and plus Jefferson County Open Space and Headwaters Trails Alliance, who had been starting to use the content, helped us put together this instructor guide starting last year and into just about, I think we wrapped it up 2 or 3 weeks ago. So it's a pretty fresh guide, and we're going to be starting to push it out there here over the coming summer. And it's really, the objective of the whole content really boils down to this, that it's meant to teach volunteers working in groups of no more than 3 everything they need to know to accomplish basic maintenance of trails while working independently. And so, we call it independent stewardship for trails, but I think what it boils down to is what's essentially a trail adopter model. So if you and a couple of your buddies want to get out on your own time to do some drain cleaning, corridor clearing, tread maintenance, that's what we're talking about. And that's really in the content that we put together where the sidebars are on the course. Now, there's certainly a lot more that you could do in an independent fashion as you gain experience and confidence from your sponsors, agencies, so on and so forth. But this is our jumping off point for this. It kind of came about, especially with Forest Service groups and Forest Service groups is where we've seen the most growth. That routine maintenance is one of the hardest things to get to. And so training individuals to go out and accomplish it on their own has been seen as pretty valuable. And so within that content are these sections: agency protocol, basic risk assessment, accomplishment reporting, tool and safety talk, and a trails overview, and we focus on basic trail maintenance in this course. And so again, those of you that have taught or been involved in the crew leader trainings in the past, those are all going to look pretty familiar. So as it stands, it's intended to be an 8-hour course. So essentially done in a single day. And then again, because we're looking at a pretty basic and flexible course, we also want to keep the training commitment pretty, shall we say, basic and flexible as well. Now, there's some caveats to that that I'll get into here shortly. But one of the things in the instructor guide is suggested agendas. And as you can see here, we kind of got it broken down. These are 2 suggested agendas. On the left is the agenda that's found in there for folks that did some sort of pre-course preparation. And generally what we mean by that is folks that have gone through the online content that we put together as well that I'll describe. And as you can see, the time frame for that, each individual classroom element is trimmed down quite a bit. And that time is then given over to the actual skills practice towards the end of the training, versus if you are doing everything from the ground up in person, just spend a little bit more time in the classroom and not as much time out on the trail. And this, I think, is pretty critical. As we did pilot this course over the last few years, I was getting feedback that, yeah, that even with the basic content that's in here, the timing was fairly compressed to try to get all of this stuff done in an 8-hour day. And so, one, that's one of the big reasons we implemented an online learning element. We are also right now, different from our other manuals, allowing some limited digital sharing of the trainee guide so that it can be read ahead of time. And so I'll talk a little bit about that as well, where that is. But generally speaking, what we're recommending is that to cover all this stuff, whether you have trainees do some preparation ahead of time or whether you get them from the ground up in front of you for a single Saturday, say, that you can cover it in 8 hours. You get a little bit more time to practice skills if you have them do some prep work. That being said, there is room for all of this and no more. And so if you need to teach them how to do new trail construction, if you want to teach them more advanced technical skills, with the CDTC as an example, they have to talk to them about making sure that the signage and the blazes on the trees for the trail are correct, this sort of thing. That's all fine. It's just you're going to have to take more time to do it, is what our recommendation is. That this 8 hours is really set for the very specific elements that we're going to cover in each module.
Dan, I like the way it's set up as kind of a core that you can, use as a basis and revisit or expand on it on the different sections there. I'm working with a group up in Estes Park right now, the Cycling Coalition, that's adopting a trail with Christy Wumkus up here. Mm-hmm. And, it's going to be an ongoing thing. So I'll have that opportunity for teachable moments.
Absolutely. And I think, it kind of is in line with how I kind of see a lot of how volunteering works across many groups. If you can give people a simple way to get involved, and the people that really enjoy it will self-select into increasing levels of involvement and technical ability. And so this is a really pretty cut and dry entry point for folks, even more cut and dry than just a basic crew leader training, and then you can build out from there. So this is actually the first instructor guide that we've made. The OSI, I told myself I was going to count it up. It's numerous curricula that we have, that we've built over the years. The crew leader training was the only one that ever got an instructor guide. And so that we sought to remedy that, especially with some courses that we saw some growth area in, this one being one of them. In any case, we based it on the crew leader instructor guide, and like that guide, it contains background and context info for instructors, suggested agendas and materials that you should collect for a training, or you should have on hand for a training, lesson plans, including an intro and a conclusion, as well as the core learning modules. And in each of those lesson plans are included objectives, a recommended time allowance, sample lectures, and various types of activities that you can do. And of course, that's just our recommendations. You're only limited in activities by your own imagination. And then it is differentiated, and this is true for the most recent crew leader instructor manual as well. It's differentiated between content that is for a traditional classroom, and any by which we mean if you had everybody show up on Saturday morning and they haven't done anything else, versus online learning, where how do you change your delivery if they've done some of that prep work, or if they've done the online course. Here's our recommendations for how you change your delivery now. And Mick, as you hinted at there, it's a guide. I like to say it's a guide, not a mandate. And I think there's value in both. No matter how you're teaching the class, there's value in kind of going through both elements of the traditional versus online as you work your way through this guide. And you know, there's just a lot in there that can help you set up your course. And we certainly, you know, have all our recommended agendas, recommended time allowance, sample lectures, activity, yada, yada, yada. But as far as use goes, as long as you're hitting on the objectives, which are clearly outlined in the instructor guide, we try to give instructors and groups the, you know, the flexibility they need to tailor it to their unique needs and their unique sort of comfort level, the techniques that they like to use when they're teaching. And so again, I like to say it's a guide, not a mandate in this case. And like I said, I'll be sending out the online link to get a look at it. And then once you get that, if you haven't already, just send me an email back if you want to set up getting some hard copies to you. So as far as the pre-training preparation goes, there's two things that we have. The first is the online OSI Guide to Independent Stewardship for Trails. And it's hosted in partnership with Colorado Mountain College. 3 to 4 hours self-paced. Some people might do it in a little less, some people might do it in a little more. It essentially covers all of the classroom content, plus it has video examples of trail maintenance techniques and other elements. And so it's again, to compare it against how we've been doing crew leader training with online. In the crew leader training, we're kind of taking some of the time away from the in-person training in return for the time that the people have done in the online work. So instead of doing 2 full 16-hour days, we're currently doing for crew leader training, if they've done the online modules, 1 8-hour day and 1 4-hour day for that. With this, we're still recommending that you're doing 8-hour days on top, an 8-hour day on top of the online work, just because again, you're really compressing a lot of information into a full day. And this really helps people come with, 1, some of that learning already knocked out, and 2, everybody's got the same baseline of knowledge before they get to you. So again, you're a little bit ahead of the curve when you start your 8-hour day and course.
Hey, Dan.
Yes, sir.
I guess you can probably say it's really strongly recommended that people take the online class before coming out to the field. It does make the class go much quicker, and right. You know, you can condense the in classroom part of, and then you lose time being out on the trail. So really strongly
right.
recommended that this happens.
No, that's absolutely true. And I think, you know, especially for this course, you know, we found that it has a lot of added benefit on the basis of Steve just described, especially, yes, that you get more time just to have them out on the trail, you know, at least half a day, as opposed to maybe, you know, only 2 to 3 hours if you're trying to teach it from the ground up. And then we'll get in, this is outlined a little bit, or this is outlined not a little bit, this is outlined a lot in the instructor guide, and we can get into a little bit of it. But the way that I really have started describing the difference between if you're teaching any OSI course with online preparation versus if it's, you know, no preparation. If there's no preparation by the students, you're telling them kind of what they need to know, right? Kind of almost 100%. Versus if they've done if they have prepared, especially if they've done the online course, you're trying to get them to tell you what they learned. You're really reviewing each module and checking for retention of core objectives. And then, you know, once you get them out on the trail, then it's back to, okay, here's how we clean a drain or improve tread, whatever it is you're teaching them. But it becomes a much shorter and teaching experience and much more based around, to cast forward a little bit, if you're doing basic risk assessment, instead of saying, here are the 3 terms that define risk assessment: hazard, likelihood, and outcome. It says, who can remember what the 3 terms were? I'll wait to see if they tell you what they are. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, what does that mean? Okay, what does that mean? Just having that. And we found through crew leader training, sometimes it can be tough to coax that out of everybody. Some classes are going to be better than others. And we just don't do it open book. If we have the manual in front of us, we're just doing it open book. It's just who can, if you don't remember off the top of your head, who can go into the book and tell me the answer to this. So there is a cost for this. All of our online modules are $35 per person. Now this would mostly be, excuse me, I just got lost track. So right now, though, we do recognize that budgets are getting a lot tighter with COVID-19, and if partners do want to utilize the online learning, I can't make it 100% free. Just as an FYI, especially during these kind of crazy times, if folks still want to utilize this, but that price point's a little too much, I always encourage folks to reach out to me and to explore what the options might be for getting that discounted. Well, I'm going to jump into the individual modules. So as we go through this, basically I'm going to be kind of going through each, and I want to stop after each one and just get thoughts, questions, and chiming in on any other ideas for how it's taught. So with agency protocol, this is one that pretty much, with a few updates, comes straight out of the crew leader training, both for trails and ecological restoration. The main difference, I think, is, in my experience, and those of you that have utilized it, you can weigh in, but we tend to kind of, at best, zip through this module in crew leader training, and most of the time we don't really cover it much at all. And I think part of it being that in this model where you have, for crew leader training, I kind of look at it as like, I just showed up to the parking lot and 8 to 10 people who I don't know showed up, and I've got to now put them to work. A lot of times the agency protocol is figured out for you by somebody else as a crew leader. And I think that tends to be where people that deliver the course kind of lean on. If you're volunteering independently, we're assuming that's absolutely not the case, and that you actually, as a volunteer, have a lot more work that you need to do to actually effectively understand what the expectations are from your sponsoring agency, both in priorities and what they'll allow you to work on, and priorities in trail maintenance, and any paperwork or very specific risk assessment or accomplishment reporting protocols that you may need to put in place. And so we actually kick the independent stewardship training off with agency protocol. It's the very first thing we hit on for those reasons.
Well, I think that's a great approach, Dan, and I use that a lot too when discussing these things, because it's kind of a broad view vision. What's the nature of the relationship with the primary group or agency that you're allying with. Some organizations will ally with 5, 6, 7, county, city, Forest Service, etc., whereas others may be singular purpose, like a friends group.
Right. Absolutely. And I think, that's just it. Again, if it's a key part of gaining comfort from those sponsors, of empowering people to go out on their own, that they're doing it in a way that the agency is going to be comfortable with and amenable to. And both in the online learning and if you're doing it in person, whether you're teaching it from the ground up or you're just reviewing it, the main thing that we're looking at with the trainees is this agency and organizational protocol checklist. So kind of moving through it point by point to make sure that they understand, kind of what this all means and where they need to go to find out this information before they get started with any volunteering, what the paperwork, if any, like waivers and whatnot, that they need to sign, where is that, where can they find that, what are their expectations if they're going to bring other people on that haven't received this training, these types of things. And so in a lot of this training, and this is the first part that I'll bring it up, there's a lot of room for what's unique about the specific group that you are volunteering for, that you can teach to. You can look at this and say, as an instructor, if I don't need this for my specific agency or organization, then I don't need to teach to it. Or if there's something very specific that I need to talk to people about within here, or something that's not even on this list that I need to make sure gets covered, this is where it gets covered. And oh, shoot, lost my train of thought. Yeah, so I think that's about it. And with that, it's a pretty straightforward module, but again, a lot more important than I think it would be in another training setting. And the other part of this that we're usually hitting on is this idea, and this is what the title of it, taken out of the trainee guide, is the importance of on-trail demeanor. And at a minimum, we're telling folks everything that's on the left-hand side here. So if you're out on your own and you're not clearly with an organized group, you need to be courteous, explain your work is simply maintaining the existing trail, and assure anyone in the public that your volunteer work has been pre-authorized by the land manager, and that spreading the word about your training could very well inspire other trail users to get to volunteer as well. So it's really important to be able to at least do those three things when engaging with the public. Now, of course, right now, might need to throw in a COVID-19 caveat with any of that, but that's not an official part of the guide. One thing that we have done that I think is potentially doable in this segment, it depends on how much time you feel like devoting to it, but we have kind of dabbled in bringing in sort of authority of the resource as part of this. And that, could especially be useful for groups doing this where folks are kind of doubling as public contact volunteers. Maybe they're out doing trail patrol, but they've got a shovel or a pick in their hand and are doing some basic maintenance. There's not a whole lot of time for it. And again, it does take away from any other time that you might spend doing anything else. But, I've got a link here to this YouTube video, and I'm going to share this as a PDF as well, but you can easily Google authority of the resource video, and it'll bring you to the Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics video, which is pretty good, and was what we've tacked on top of this in some other training. So Steve, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, you may not have time in the class to present the authority of the resource and the techniques that are used. However, it might be good for you to print off some of the different scenarios that are available online and be able to hand those out to the folks so they can maybe read through it before they go out onto the trail. But it's really, I think it's one of the more important things for the independent stewardship folks to be really aware of is, they're really working for the agency, and the demeanor that they have to have on the trail will reflect on the agency if they're discourteous or whatever the case may be. So just a different way to communicate and talk to people about things they may or may not be doing in accordance with Leave No Trace and the regulations of whatever area they're working in.
I have to agree with you, Steve. We identify it as you are an ambassador of the agency at some level whenever the public comes across your trail crew. So, there is that added responsibility of tact and diplomacy.
So, Mick, does that mean that you've quit hitting people with Picmatic handles?
I just ask them to weigh a rock bar in their hands.
Okay, all right.
They get an idea.
Cool. Anything else on this segment? Any questions or comments on other thoughts, ideas? All right. So it's a little out of order with the trainee guide, but the next, in terms of the recommended agenda for the instructor, the next segment is basic risk assessment. And I think it's important to do it this way because if you kind of go over the umbrella concepts of risk assessment, that really sets up everything else in terms of safety and the tool talk and the safety talk that you'll come to later. And so again, taken straight out of the crew leader training, more or less, you're identifying the potential risks for a project, considering possible hazards associated with those risks, and preventing injuries by recognizing and communicating about risks and hazards to a crew. Now, in the guide, and important for anybody teaching a trail adopter course, is if you are going to allow people to go out on their own, you do need to remind them that these types of reviews have to be done internally, individually, whatever. They need to be doing some sort of individual risk assessment if they're not vocalizing it to a group of people that they're working with. And as an FYI, there is actually a lot more in the trainee guide than OSI is recommending in the instructor guide be taught in person. Specifically, there's a risk assessment matrix in there that's really great and informative and gives people a lot more stuff they can chew on post-training or pre-training, as the case may be. But we're not recommending that you need to go over this very detailed matrix as part of this training. You really need to make sure people have a grasp of the basics, because you're going to come back to more safety stuff later anyway, where you're getting down into very specifics about managing safety on the trail. So we're recommending that instructors are only sticking to the risk assessment definitions of hazard, likelihood, and outcome, the hazard to guess activity that I'll come to in just a minute, and job hazard analysis or any pre-existing risk assessment documents from the agency or the group as needed. And so this hazard to guess scenario, as it kind of rolls out in the instructor guide, if you're teaching it without any pre-workshop preparation, you're going over the definitions and teaching everybody what they mean, or reviewing them if they have done the preparation and doing a little more quickly. But both sides, we're recommending you're doing at least a quick scenario activity with folks. And if you haven't seen this, it's pretty easy to replicate. There is a worksheet that has this in the instructor guide. There's a worksheet in the trainee guide. You can make a spreadsheet that does this pretty quickly. But the idea is that you either give them a picture, or I certainly recommend, that this can be done in the field as well. If you want to just go ahead and get out to, once you're done with the other classroom elements, move this over to your preparation for hiking to the work site. You can do a quick risk assessment exercise with just looking around you or giving them pictures. Let's identify a potential hazard. Okay, what's the injury or outcomes of that hazard? What's the likelihood? Based on all that, do we need to mitigate? Anything that has any sort of low to high likelihood with a hazardous outcome, we're usually choosing to mitigate, of course. And then, are there any measures in place, and what else do we need to do to mitigate that hazard? So it's just an activity where you're getting the group talking to you, talking to each other, and having them go through the thought process of how does risk assessment work in essentially a really basic process based on 3 things. And like I said, you can do it in the classroom if you want to show them some pictures, and these 4 pictures here come out of our crew leader training one of our training PowerPoints, and we've used it for the independent stewardship as well, but you can easily do that activity in the field. And then finally, it's an official part of this training, and it's included in the online learning as well as in the appendix of the trainee guide, is that if there is, and this is going to be especially true as you guys all know if you're working with the Forest Service, if there is an existing job hazard analysis that folks need to use, then we need to be reviewing it, understanding what's in it. You might come back to it, and we'll come back to it in a minute, but you might come back to it when you get down to actually practicing the safety talk at the start of the day. But if there's something specific to use, you need to be bringing that up at some point, and this is potentially a good time to do it.
And that would be that you want to make sure that you have the latest JHA or risk analysis for the particular agency that you're working for. If it's a ranger district or BLM office, whatever the case may be, and not necessarily have this one in the presentation. It may be that you do that as a handout to make sure that everybody has the document that's appropriate for the area.
Right, that's correct. We have a sample document, but it comes from our local ranger district 4 years ago. So who knows how up to date it is at this point. This would be on the instructor to figure out what they need to get and present to the class. Any other questions on that before we move on to this next section? Or thoughts on how to do ideas for teaching risk assessment? All right.
Well, it's a simple thing, but I mean, this is just a real easy area just to kind of ask the group what could happen and just draw it out of them. And it rolls out pretty naturally. And then you can have a little dialogue and you can fill in the blanks. But, you know, most people that are doing this are at least experienced hikers or cyclists or runners or all of the above. And they kind of get it. So it just, you know, it's real good for trainee participation.
No, I agree. And I think that's kind of the key. And just a good way to approach it, again, whether or not you're doing it from the ground up or with online preparation, that especially if you've done the online preparation, they've already had a lecture. And so it's more about getting the group participation, and even if they haven't, moving quickly from the definitions to the group participation is kind of our recommendation. And again, just kind of keeping this particular course humming along to the extent that you can is really important to get it all done in a day. Anything else?
I think it ties in, Dan, with overall risk management, you know, the safety net aspect of things, the trying to inculcate with the crew members or the recipients of the training this whole culture of safety, in the sense that, you know, a successful project is one where somebody doesn't break their arm or crush their fingers.
Right.
So everybody has a role to play, basically, and
Right.
raising that to an explicit rather than just okay, we've done all this background work. Now that we're on site, we don't need to worry about it as much, when it's really a constant review.
Right. Absolutely. And that's definitely you know, as you will know from the crew leader training, one of the key takeaways is that you do this always before you go, when you're out on the field, every time you go. And Mick, you mentioned the safety net. I'm going to come back. I positioned for purposes of this presentation, I positioned the emergency plan with the safety talk, but I think that this is absolutely another appropriate time to review that specific element, and is part of this training is to make sure everybody's clear on what the emergency plan, safety net, all that is as well.
They are tied together, yes.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, the only last thing I'll say is the younger the group you're working with, the more you need to talk about this, because, you know, young, especially men, but young people in general are, you know, still think they're invulnerable and will live forever, and they're prone to either consciously or unconsciously showing off, you know. And you know, I have to tell people, I don't want to see you making any hero swings with that pick, you know. It's all below the waist, you know. It's like, we'll get it a little bit at a time. And you know, I've had to like intercede with young guys and say, stop it, you know, when they're out there doing the hands-on. And I'm sure, you know, the others on the call here probably have a lot more experience with that, but that's what I've seen. The younger, the more you got to really kind of drive this home.
Sure. Well, I think, again, it's important to note that there's there's more than one set time to cover this information in this training. So you are driving it home for sure. All right, well, let's keep going then. Accomplishment reporting is the only new module, really. We updated a lot of the modules from the crew leader training to fit in with this, but accomplishment reporting is really the only brand new one that we came up with for this course. And again, that's because if you're volunteering independently, you can't assume anybody but you is going to be keeping track of what you got done and reporting back on it to the appropriate people. And so we need to make sure that people understand why effective accomplishment reporting is important, knowing the specific data they're expected to collect and how to properly collect it according to the preferences of the sponsor, and know how to provide their sponsor with their accomplishment reports. So it's pretty, I think, straightforward. If they take the online learning, they get a lot of this first bullet. You know, why is it important? And you don't have to cover that very much. And you can really just dive into what specifically do you need to collect and how do you get it to us. we set this in the suggested agenda as part of the morning classroom, but again, could be moved around, I think, a little bit. And as I'll get to, the activity that we recommend to this actually happens later at the end of the day. So I'll kind of come to that. But generally,
go ahead. Sorry, Dan.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Generally, in the importance part of this, and this is what it's not really. I think it was a bit of a missed element in the trainee guide. We've added it to the online guide, the online course. The importance is we really break it down into, well, why do you track volunteer time? Well, you need to understand who's involved, and the sponsors want to be able to turn that time into a value, both in terms of output and a dollar value, so they can talk to people about what's the value of what we got done. And of course, tracking accomplishments, well, you want to be able to be tracking what's getting done. It helps with planning and setting future priorities. And if you do require it, or you are asking people to do it, we're also suggesting that this is a part of the training we're talking about. Not only report on what you got done, but if you came across something that's either outside the scope of what you're allowed to do, or like it's a tree tipped over and fell on the trail and you weren't able to address it, well, you should still report on blowdowns, for instance, on the trail. So it's both about what did you do and reporting on stuff that you think should be prioritized for future work as well. And then with the specifics of how to report, I'm just pulling up an example here. This is where, as an instructor, if you're not already, it's really important to figure out from the sponsoring organization, what do you need? In this case, I pulled up a photo of the Continental Divide Trail Coalition. This is their adopter report on their website that they asked people to fill out. So if they were doing the training, or they would pull this up and show people how to use it. On the Clear Creek and South Platte Ranger Districts, Ralph Bratt has put together a Survey 123 app that goes on people's smartphones, and in trainings that we've done. We just did one for campsite inventory, a webinar, he went through how to use that. So especially if they've done the online work, this is pretty simple. You just need to find some time to talk to them about, here's what you need to collect data on. Here's how to get it to the person that needs to receive it. And that's pretty much it.
What you might ask is from the agency is if they have an online or a phone app that you could use to record the accomplishments, as well as what needs to be completed if you didn't have time. I know the Colorado Mountain Club has recently come up with an app that a lot of organizations or agencies have adopted throughout the state to use, but ask whatever agency that you're really working for what app that is, or if they have one, and how to report back to them if they don't have, what kind of documentation they need.
Right. And sometimes it may be as simple as, well, send me an email, send
Yeah,
me an email with what you got
exactly.
done. Yeah. So whatever that looks like, you just need to be making sure people are square on it.
Dan, is this something that is tied into agency protocol? I tend to think it is. How do you think of it in terms of presentation? Standalone?
Yeah. I think you could do it either way, Mick. I think it absolutely makes sense as a very natural thing to segue into from agency protocol.
Mm-hmm.
I think as we treat it as a standalone just because we give it kind of extra importance in this case. Like, we really need to be thinking about accomplishment reporting as its own thing, not necessarily. Of course, it is a part of agency protocol, but it's also a very important consideration in its own right. That being said, I think, yeah, if you were to, be developing your agenda for a training and you said, I really want to do agency protocol, then accomplishment reporting, I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I tend to think of it as you have the general agency protocol, and that's kind of a big picture overview. What's the relationship? How's it work, et cetera. Then you drill down and get specific with this accomplishment reporting. Okay, how do we make what you're doing meaningful to the organization? And Steve touched on the app too. How do you record it? Is there a field app that is easily transferable? What's the agency using that is going to be most meaningful? Because when you tie those things together, then you get the most value out of it. If you're creating something that is Greek to the agency in the transmission, other than simplifying it down to an email list or something, you have to get your apples and apples together on that.
Sure. That's a good point.
What you might consider though too is that if you have a phone app or you're reporting your accomplishments to the agency, that's great. But you might want to think about also making sure that you report those accomplishments to your organization as well. So you're able to put that down at the end of the year report that you accomplished all of this, and so it looks like you've really done something. But if you're just reporting it one way to the agency, you're kind of losing out on some hours and accomplishments.
True. Thanks, Steve.
Yep.
Anything else on this?
I think it's worth highlighting by itself because people kind of forget about it. Steve and Mick are very experienced, and I really appreciate your understanding of agency needs and all of that. Even here, we established a little Dropbox account, and people can just go in and fill in their stuff in an Excel spreadsheet, and we report it to the board. But it's something that's often just kind of forgotten about. It's like, well, I did the work, that's what counts. Well, yes, it is, but
Right.
it's important to highlight your work.
Well, the last thing I'll say, and this gets at we do have a recommended activity as part of the instructor guide for this, and that I think is a really important one to do. So at the end of the day, at some point, you're going to be walking off the trail after having spent some length of time working on some stuff. And this is a really good time to either yourself as the instructor or assign somebody to count up all the accomplishments. And then once you get back down the trail, you can say, okay, everybody, this is how much we got done. And if possible, you can pull something out and note it right then, or, just in general, this is one of the things that can be easily reinforced as part of the workday later on in the training, that you make sure you're taking time right then and you're modeling kind of the behavior that you want, that before we left, we made sure to account for our accomplishments.
I think also, Dan, is to understand how the agency wants you to count hours. So in other words, Mick, if you think about, you leave Fort Collins and drive up to, let's say, the Rewas, how many hours is that for you to drive up there?
Yeah, and the agency sometimes has input on that.
Yeah, and you're actually volunteering that time. So you want to make sure that you understand what the agency expects for reporting hours. I know when I work for the Friends of Mount Evans and Lost Creek, we count the hours from the time we leave home until the time we get back. So,
yeah, that's a good point to define, make explicit, come to agreement with.
yeah.
All right. So these are essentially two separate modules as they're presented in both the trainee guide and the instructor guide. For our purposes and thinking about how to teach them, I wanted to lump them together, and you'll see why. But objective wise, again, this is going to look very familiar to those of you who've been doing this for a while. With the tool and safety talk, we're identifying and describing various tools and their uses, teaching a crew about CUS, the carrying, using, storing, and safety with hand tools, being aware of the most efficient, appropriate tools for a project, and selecting the right tools for a project. And on the other side, with the safety talk, we're kind of calling it just, again, to sort of capture the folks that might be working independently, performing a safety review on their own or with a small group to introduce the focus on safety issues before starting work, to list safety issues that are of concern on a project, to understand the use and purpose of risk management forms such as JHAs, although as we discussed, you might also bring that up in the risk assessment process, or you might cover them both. Oops, wrong way. And then finally, as part of this, although I didn't have it there, talking about the emergency plan, although of course, again, you might bring up the emergency plan with risk assessment, might bring up the emergency plan with agency protocol. So, wherever you feel it's most appropriate to discuss. Now, I wanted to make this point with this training, and I've seen with crew leader training, I've seen it done a number of different ways over the years where the tool and safety talk falls in. Maybe we're doing it in the classroom. Maybe we're modeling it at the trailhead on our way to the work site. With an independent steward training, regardless of what sort of prep work the students have done, I will say this: if you aren't already at the trailhead, this is a really good time to be there. when you're doing the tool and safety talk. And that really will help you save time. Just kind of forget about doing this in the classroom if that was your habit. You've got an opportunity to model the right behavior on your way to working to the work site, and you can really cover it there. And then it's especially true if they've already gone through some of the prep work. So tools equals going through carry, use, safety, and storage, and making sure that you've cussed at least once each of the tools that you'll be using, and maybe modeling it once as the instructor with one tool and then going around the circle and having everybody else take a turn with a different tool. And then safety talk, we've got the checklist in the trainee guide. It is really, modeling that start of day safety talk, going through all the things that we need to be aware of, making sure everyone's got their water, food, PPE, and the list goes on, understanding who's got what first aid certifications, making sure everyone's aware of the emergency plan, how far are we hiking in. I'll stop there. I don't want to belabor it. There's a printed out list. It's an opportunity to go over it with the class. And I think in this case, plus or minus a little more context, you're pretty much doing the same thing whether or not they've done any prep work. Just if they have done some prep work, then you're more diving into, okay, let me model this for you, and then we're each going to take a turn. And you might do more of like a safety circle with the safety talk with the trainees, where everybody takes a turn bringing up a safety element to discuss before hitting the trail.
Dan, this is also a good opportunity to use the cards that each of the volunteers will be getting,
Right.
making sure that they understand what's on there and how to use them, and explain, to use them as a crutch to explain everything that we've got going on, or they've got going on for the day.
Right. Absolutely. That's a good point, Stephen. I hadn't brought that up yet. I meant to, but
Sorry.
no worries. I'm glad you reminded me. For these trainings, we've essentially been handing out the quick reference cards minus the blue cards, minus the crew leader stuff, which has the crew leader's daily reminder and the feedback and the conflict resolution stuff. That may still be useful, but since we're not teaching to it as part of this training, those are really the elements that do not appear in this training. We're not handing them out, but the red safety cards and the black trail cards do get handed out for reference for people that are taking a trail adopter training. Now, again, for your own use in your own groups, whatever, mix and match as you'll like. The way that we're doing it, if it's not a crew leader training, we're leaving the blue cards at home. And again, this might be the time where you've brought up the emergency plan if you haven't already. This is what's in the appendix of the trainee guide is a sample emergency plan. This comes from our local partner on the South Platte Ranger District. But, what to do in the case of emergency, how to contact first responders, how to activate the safety net. There's a lot of this just in general, in general terms, in both the crew leader training and the independent stewardship for trails training. But in the independent stewardship for trails training, we're recommending that there's likely, if you're going out on your own time, whether it's individually or in a small group, there's very likely some sort of specific plan that you need to follow. And if there's not, there really should be. Maybe you have to figure out that plan, but you need to have that ideally as a printed out copy is what we're recommending. But in any case, you need to know what that plan is before you volunteer. If there is an emergency, what do you need to do? So if you haven't covered that already, it's kind of last chance to do it before you hit the trail.
Seems like if you're working with another volunteer group, adopt a trail as such, it may be fairly easy if that trail is something they're going to be making repeat visits to, or that general area, for example, that you may have to consider helping them develop a boilerplate that they're always going to have and just change the dates. Maybe the names of the the medics. So, I find that to be pretty helpful to at least have some physical reference in the hand of the crew or group leader.
Right. And it's in the appendix of the trainee guide. And so, if nothing else, there's something they can start with. We even have a sample waiver in that book as well. If you have a group that doesn't have a liability waiver, there's something they can check out and see if they can put that to their use. But in any case, this particular one was developed by our partnering ranger district. So it's possible that they have something, and I think this one is for both staff and volunteers, if I'm not wrong. So, you know, checking with the sponsoring agency organization pre-training if there's anything that exists that should be used is important.
Good point.
Anything else on that particular segment before we are getting close to the end here with the actual trail stuff? Cool. Well, again, this is very similar to the crew leader for trails curriculum, with the very important exception of there is no trail construction taught. Now that may be different. It just depends on what you want to do. I know from talking with some folks that the CDTC works with down in New Mexico for, you know, this ranger district that manages trails in the Gila Wilderness. They'd rather just reroute as much as possible rather than do a bunch of light maintenance everywhere, though who knows. But in any case, they'd rather teach people how to do trail construction than how to clean drains. You know, that's their prerogative. In that case, you know, they may want to swap out some stuff for trail construction, or they just may want to budget a little more time to do trail construction. You know, Jim, I know we talked about, for instance, you know, we have some resources. We have some free resources on the VOC website now where we have 6-step method videos and stuff that people can watch. So there's a lot of other resources to tie into this that you can add. But in any case, the official curriculum, we only cover the trails overview that's relatively identical to what's in crew leadership for trails, and then the basic maintenance stuff, which covers corridor maintenance, tread maintenance, and drainage structure maintenance. And again, the thought is that the priority for this training is teaching folks how to get out and do like light maintenance sweeps, essentially. And so that's how that came about, as how we prioritize that content. But the objectives of the trails overview are very much the same: identifying basic concepts of trail development and planning, including how trails are planned for sustainability, and identifying and defining basic trail anatomy. Now, again, if they've taken the online learning portion, they got this in a pretty substantial lecture form already. And so we'll get into kind of the walk and talk segment, which is a part of a lot of trails trainings, and that this is really where you're starting to plan out your walk and talk. But just moving on. So the traditional classroom teaching of this, if you didn't have any prep work, it can tend to get pretty lecture heavy, whether you have a PowerPoint or whether you're moving through the manual. You know, I understand that there is some need to kind of present the concepts and then go out on the trail. I've seen some people successfully do it all on the trail, especially if folks have their quick reference cards or their manuals with them. It kind of depends on the comfort level of the instructor and what that instructor likes to do. That being said, in independent stewardship, you want to be tying all of these things clearly to how the trail should be maintained and what the specific maintenance objectives of the agency are, because the slight difference is that we're trying to empower these volunteers to go out and make some of these decisions on their own. So they may not always have somebody to lean on that can say, you know, do this, don't do that. And so at least for the start in the beginner class, having a very clear set of objectives is here's what you can do on your own is pretty important. And that's why kind of tying all this together with what are the maintenance objectives on this specific trail or system of trails that we'll be working on is important. And then much of the rest can be done in the field. And again, especially if they've already done the online work, you know, you can quickly, you know, review, okay, so who can give me an example of some different user groups? Why is it important to consider those? Who remembers what makes a trail sustainable? Let's talk about that for a few minutes. You know, what are some other priorities agencies will set around how they manage their trails? And that gets into the objective section, which is like, well, they might want to have a technical mountain biking trail. They might want to have an interpretive trail that's open to families, you know, so on and so forth. And then for the trail vocabulary and anatomy, you stand on the trail. What am I standing on? That's the tread. Point to the critical edge. What is this? That's the critical edge. You know, what's the back slope? You know, kind of getting them to tell you what they learned while making sure that you're checking that they understand the definitions and covering anything that they don't get. So utilizing the space that you're on to go back and cover the anatomy. And again, with the quick reference card and with the book, you can revisit the diagrams and stuff if you want to while you're out in the field. So with the walk and talk, regardless of whether they've done the online prep or not, we're saying 1 to 1.5 hours. And it's ideal if you can walk and talk all the way out to a stopping point, maybe take a lunch break, and then work your way back doing maintenance and other skills practice the rest of the way. And again, it's 60 to 90 minutes for walk and talk on the trail. If you go back and look at the sample agenda, there's more time given to the trails overview if they haven't done the online learning, and that's just because we're budgeting more time to introduce all these concepts fresh. The trail anatomy, the objectives, sustainability. You have to do that, and then you still get out for some sort of walk and talk afterwards. Now, if you can integrate all that into the walk and talk, so much the better. It saves you more time for actually getting work done on the trail.
Does anybody still use whiteboards on those walk and talks?
I actually haven't seen it, no, but that's I can see how that would be useful. If you got a little a little hand-sized whiteboard that you can draw on. Do you
Right.
still do that, Mick?
I do, not every time, but when it's appropriate and time available, yeah, it's, visuals to me are very helpful for people, tying in that visual, auditory, kinetic.
Mm-hmm. And I do know, some folks may choose to use this training course without necessarily looking to get new manuals, new quick reference cards all the time. And so if they're doing that, then having a whiteboard handy is going to be I would say, a critical step to be able to do visuals while on the trail. I've seen people draw in the dirt.
The QR cards are very, very helpful in that regards too.
Right.
But in the COVID, we're not passing those around. We're not passing one set.
Right, for sure. That's right. Everybody needs to have their own. That's true. Well, anything else? But we'll finish up with just sort of the specifics of the trail maintenance practice. Anything else on the trails overview? I mean, again, I'm doing a quick hit here, assuming you've got the basics. If you've done the crew leader training or you have the trail knowledge already, it's all going to be familiar to you. So this is more about the structure and how to deliver it. Any other thoughts on effectively teaching or anything I missed that is typically covered?
Well, I think important to this discussion, Dan, in terms of trail maintenance and understanding what the agency wants out of this. Do they want simply clear, open, and drained? Or we come across trail groups, as an example, that say, well, how much can I reroute? That's one of their first questions. Because Forest Service trails are notoriously a lot of old roads, et cetera. So those need to be explicitly defined, I think, as to what the limitations of trail maintenance are. And then it's prioritizing what's the best bang for your buck.
And I agree, and I think I had that in here. But since you brought it up, Mick, yeah, we have the standard kind of OSI priorities. I think it says if you have to make decisions first, anything that is a hazard, do correct that. Then bring it back to the plan design standard. I can't remember them off the top, but there's 3 kind of ways to prioritize. But in this training, absolutely, we're actually try to figure out what the specific agency priorities are first. And if you don't have that, then you can lean on those kind of general priorities as well.
Hey, Mick, I found that if you are knowledgeable about NEPA and you can present the NEPA ins and outs, after a while, those people fall asleep and they decide that they don't really want to reroute anything. So just keep that in mind, okay?
I was going to say the answer to that question, how much can I reroute on my own on National Forest, is none. And I think Steve just hit on why.
Good
You can
point.
point out the need for it and maybe get somebody out there to.
Yeah, do you have $50,000 or $100,000 to pay for a study? And here's what it involves.
Yeah, that's a whole nother discussion there.
Right. Right. Well, so with this, I can't remember. Okay. So again, it's recognizing what the trail maintenance issues are. And I think, we've done some trainings, Steve, you'll recall working, say, with our partners on the Clear Creek Ranger District, they're fairly open to everything within the scope of the light maintenance that's taught in this training versus, I know you did a training on the Holy Cross Ranger District a few years back where it was very limited. I can't remember what it was, but their trail adopters were only allowed to do a very specific set.
Yeah, they could not. They could clear corridor, and that was really about it. They didn't want them doing a lot of cleaning of drains, no rock moving, no creating drains or anything. That was down the road 2 or 3 years before they would be allowed to do something like that.
Got it. But as OSI as a training program, I mean, we're open to going anywhere, and so that's another thing. As an instructor going out to teach this, it's really imperative that you're understanding from the agency partners what those limitations are, and it may be fairly prescriptive in that case, or it may be more open-ended in others. So just on the instructor to figure that out. And then in the context of this course, these are really the things that we're hitting on: recognizing trail maintenance issues and how they develop, how to properly prune the trail corridor, repair or maintain the tread, and clean water bars. You might add new nicks and swales, but in this context, we are not teaching people how to build a brand new drainage dip of any kind. It's just how to maintain existing ones. Now, again, that's up to the group whether or not they want to tack that on. I think it could be successfully coordinated, although it might take more time than just this training for someone to really get good at understanding where a new drainage dip might go. This, as we all know, current trends in the trail world continue, I think, to kind of move away from adding a lot of new drains, although it still is a part of trail maintenance in some areas as well. So just kind of what are the objectives of the trail and what are you working with? And so this is recommended that ideally you're making this part of your walk and talk. So that 90-ish minutes that's budgeted for that needs to both include the review of the overall concepts plus a review of all the maintenance concepts. And so this really means ideally you need to be visiting this trail ahead of time and figuring out what's out there, scoping out your site, making sure you're satisfied that you have a walk and talk segment that is going to meet your needs, both in terms of enough to walk and talk about and enough to work on the way back out. And so focus areas are corridor, tread, and drainage structures, but also worthwhile to discuss how is water moving on this trail and causing maintenance issues. Are there any user-created problems that are coming up? And what out here is worth you reporting on even if you're not addressing it, like a blowdown or a major blowout in some structure, whatever. So these are the types of things that you're covering in the walk and talk. And then as you're working your way out, the instructor needs to take time to demonstrate tasks as appropriate, certainly. And then typically we're just splitting into small work groups and taking time to review each other's work. So, not letting people get too strung out from each other, of course, I'll go ahead and say it, keeping appropriate physical distance during these times, but at the same time, within reach of each other that we could all, okay, let's stop and kind of take a look at what everybody's done, right? And kind of reviewing what worked, how did that feel, Again, there's different from the crew leader training, there is no leadership practice here. A lot of times in the crew leader training, we're implementing a role play of leadership with this while we're also doing some work. That's not a part of this. This is just simply getting down to doing some work and taking the time to review it and make sure it's done well. Ideally, everybody has a chance to do a little bit of everything. And again, minimum of 2.5 hours. If they've done the pre-work, you ideally are getting 4 hours, half a day of skill practice and only half a day of all the other stuff. And don't forget to count accomplishments on your way out. So any final thoughts on the trail maintenance, trails overview before we're kind of getting close to wrapping it up here? Hey, that's awesome. All right, so I didn't do the intro, but in the instructor's guide, there is a section that kind of details how to set up your introduction to the class. So just be aware of that. But the conclusion and bringing it all together is also a individual module for the instructors within the instructor's guide. And so in this, trainees need to be able to put together everything they've learned throughout the course to be utilized in the field. And instructors will reinforce what type of work the trainees are now allowed and not allowed to perform in independent volunteer fashion. So just making sure that you're reminding everybody of all the key takeaways and wrapping up in a productive way. And so the first thing with that is that, and this is of course true for crew leader training as well, but Independent Steward's Daily Reminder is listed in that book. And what that really does is it boils down everything that's in the context of the training into a kind of a step-by-step procedure from before you get started all the way to after you're done. So it's a really good thing as an instructor just to pull that open. And let's just go through this daily reminder as a way to wrap up, because the point is that it takes everything they just learned and puts it into and this is what it might look like throughout the course of you getting out here to do some trail maintenance for a day or whatever. So using that Independent Steward Daily Reminder is really important. Reinforcing the priorities and maintenance and other tasks that they may need to do on their specific trail, and covering anything else trainees need to make sure they get going on their own, like setting up any accomplishment reporting, making sure they get all their paperwork done. With the Continental Divide Trail Coalition, I know they try to have folks sign up for specific segments of the trail, so making sure stuff like that gets done. This is something I like to do. I always like to do a wrap-up circle, just going around one at a time. What did you take away from this training? What was your key takeaway? And they can tell you what they got out of it. And if there's something that they didn't bring up that you need to remind them of, then you know what it is. And is there any mentoring available? I do think that, we still make this recommendation. If there's the opportunity to get out with somebody who's more knowledgeable before they go out on their own, it's a valuable thing to set up. So if there's any mentoring available for trail adoption, talking about it at this point is a good way to finish the day. So, questions, comments, or any final discussion? All right, well, Mick, you got something?
I'm just thinking here, you have kind of a, and I've been looking at the Stepping Up for Stewardship modules that you present as well. Do you have any tie-in with that specifically? Because you've got a good project management and a project selection module that are free, and are they worth promoting as part of this stewardship?
I think it depends on what the objectives are. I think the main difference that I'm drawing for folks in terms of OSI versus Stepping Up Stewardship Toolkit is that OSI is meant for when you've got your program figured out and you're ready to implement it and folks just need the skills to get it done. That's what the OSI training is generally for. And we do have a project management training module too, in addition to the Stepping Up Stewardship project management module. Stepping Up Stewardship Toolkit is really about how do I set up my program? How do I implement project management procedures, volunteer recruitment, all the things that go along with actually having an effective volunteer program. So it's a level higher, I think, than the OSI in terms of sort of hierarchy of how these programs are managed. It's, OSI training is ground level, and Stepping Up Stewardship Toolkit is kind of a higher level than that in terms of kind of program management, program development.
Program management, okay.
Yeah. So I think if that were a need, then yes, absolutely it ties in, because it can be helpful in how do I set up, what kind of volunteer program do I want to set up? And is it an adopt program or is it some other program? And then from there, what training will be beneficial to empowering volunteers to then go out and accomplish the work?
Well, I'm finding it helpful to be familiar with the Stepping Up for Stewardship items, because dealing with a newbie group who wants to adopt a trail, how do they do it? There's I see correlation in both. And
what I would maybe recommend is, I see that, if you're doing the Stepping Up Stewardship stuff, if you're going to bring some of those elements into play, that could be a separate sit down with some key people in that group, right, that are going to manage the program. And then again, the training is for all the volunteers that are going to be involved on the ground level.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Both Mick and Steve talked about finding their replacements, and at our age, a lot of us are thinking about that, and maybe that's a key role, is in recruiting that and introducing them there. I found in just my brief time here working in Genesee and building this trail stewardship program, it just amazes me how people start out thinking there's nothing to trails. And I've had to kind of rein a few people in who just, let's just go out and build a trail, you know, and I'm like, oh, whoa, 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 you know, and that you take them through this, and stepping up stewardship could help with this too, but you step them through this and you inevitably get the remark, it's like, wow, I'll never look at a trail the same way again, and wow. And, you know, they do understand it, but that's kind of one of the challenges of this whole area is people think there's nothing to it. There's just a trail there and it happens. And so what if there's erosion, you know, and things like that. And so, you know, taking them deeper sometimes can really, really help that. Not that we have all that time in this course, but finding ways to turn them on to other resources, I think is a key thing.
Yeah, and I think that's always a good way to be wrapping up trainings in any case. If you've got more that they can do, and letting them know how to either take more training or get involved in a project where they can learn more is always a good way to go. You know, for our trainings, I certainly encourage our instructors to remind folks of, hey, there's always a calendar of stuff out there for OSI every year. So we're doing more stuff every year. And, you know, because the bulk of what we're putting out is the entry level stuff, the crew leader and the trail adopter. But, you know, for the smaller set of people that want to learn more, there's always more that can be learned.
Yeah, and I've thrown in too, and this is again a tough year for that, but it's like, hey, if you really want to get trained up at the hand of some really experienced people, volunteer for a VOC trail project. You know, go out there, and they've got really good people who know their stuff that will you know, help improve your skills. So a little promotion of VOC I always try to throw in.
Appreciate it, Jim. That'll make it in the recording, I'm sure.
Okay.
I think that's true for any group, is that, you always want to be talking about what's next, you know, kind of always promoting that next event and how people can gain further involvement, whether it's with you or, hey, we've got this other group that we're tied in with that's doing something awesome that you should check out too. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Appreciate it. And I'll talk to you all again real soon, I'm sure.
Dan, thank you so much for
Dan.
putting this together.
All right. You bet. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.